Good morning. This is Janice Weirs, and I'm glad to be back for the third installment of my card classes for summer 2020. Today we're going to be looking at patterned backgrounds made with cardstock, and I'm going to show you various ways of achieving some great effects to highlight elements on your card. So join me, and here we go. So to begin with, we're going to use a piece of cardstock. This is Nina Solar White 110-pound cardstock, measuring 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And we're going to be also using some strips of paper in 4 different colors, 4 colors of the same color family, cut into different widths. You can see all 4 colors and all 4 widths laid out on the page right now. Now, I used a die cutting machine and a die to cut these particular pieces, but you can do this with a trimmer as well. I'm also using liquid glue today to put these pieces down. I use liquid glue because it gives me some wiggle time. So once I lay down my piece, if it's not exactly where I want it or not exactly straight, it's okay. I can have some time to move it around. I'm also using tweezers, as I find they're much easier than trying to get my fingers in there to line things up perfectly. Now I'm going to show you just a little bit of this card, and that is the first few strips, so you can see how far apart each of these are. I am just eyeballing this. It is not measured out. And you can see I'm just using a thin amount of space in between. And here I'm just going to use a little bit of glue because I only have a small area in which to work with down here in that right corner. Once I'm done that, I'm going to go ahead and flip my project over and trim with some pretty sharp scissors all of the excess off the edges. And this makes such a huge difference. When you turn it around, you really start to get the feel for what this card is going to look like. Okay, so I trimmed that excess off so that I could use the little bit that was left over for that tiny little corner rather than starting a whole nother strip of cardstock. Good way not to waste. And I'm going to go ahead and adhere that, flip it again, and trim. As you can see, there's some glue on the overhang. That gets on my scissors, and because they're not non-stick scissors, I have to go ahead and clean them every so often with either some Goo Gone or a baby wipe. So I'm going to go ahead and add the next color, which is also the next width. This one's a little less wide. And I will keep going like this. I'll come back shortly and show you the finished product. So moving on to the second card, we're going to start with, again, a piece of cardstock, this time 5 1/2 by 4 1/4, so 5 1/2 across the top by 4 1/4. This is the dies that I used to cut these strips from the card before and this card as well. That piece I just showed is what makes all those tiny little strips, and that's what we're going to be working with today. And I set up a pattern and I numbered them. So 1 2 3 4, 3 2 1, 2 3 4, 3 2 1, etc. And then backwards on the right hand side. And this is going to make an interesting pattern as we go ahead and start gluing these strips down. And the way that I do that is I use this dot runner adhesive. You can use any kind of dry adhesive. That's going to work better than liquid adhesive for this particular process because you need longer time, so you don't want your glue drying in between. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some going to add some tape up near the top and start the process. So I'm using color number 1. Then I'm going to go to the second darkest. And I'm going to make this one a little bit longer than the first one. And it's a little tricky when you first get started, especially with trying to film. I can't get right over the top, so you'll want to be able to like see directly over your project. Moving on to the third color in the color family here. And then I will add a fourth. Now this dry adhesive, the other advantage of it is if I need to pull something up a little bit, I can. It won't rip. This isn't a super strong glue to start with. It will eventually become very strong, but when you're first using it, it stays a little sticky. So I've done the first 4, and you can see now I'm going to go back and do 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to start with my darkest and butt right up against number 1 on the top line. I'm going to continue this process using number 3, then 2, and then 1. Now there's a lot of overhang here, but that's okay, because we're going to be trimming away the excess and using all those bits as we continue on. So I'm just going to continue this process and come back when I'm completed. So going on to number 3, we're using another piece of cardstock, this time 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. If you do it the other way with this particular rectangular shape, it's hard to get the colors to fall where I wanted them. So we're starting on this side. And again, I'm using that dry adhesive, just a couple of rows to get started. And I'm going to be using my handy dandy tweezers. They're probably one of my most used tools in my studio. And these stay closed unless you press them open, which is really handy because I can grasp something with the tweezers, let go, and now I can have all the time I need to get it where I want. And I really do like this process better than trying to use my fingers. So you can see I'm using, again, 4 different colors from the same color family, and I'm going to repeat. So light, a little darker, the third darkest and the fourth, and then I'm going back to light. So this time, instead of going from light to dark and then dark to light, I'm going light to dark, light to dark, light to dark. However, I'm not going to line it up perfectly like I did the first time. I'm going to go halfway across, almost like you're weaving. And I'm going to continue in this way. You don't end up seeing colors next to each other, the same color next to each other. And I'll show you that in just a moment. Now you could choose to start anywhere on that second line and subsequent lines for a different look. This is going to end up looking like a brick wall the way that I'm going. So we're going to move on to the third line, and again, you can see here now I'm pointing out that no two of the same colors bump up against each other. And I can either start back where that first line began, or I can even shift over a little bit more and go halfway between that first brick on the second row. And this is just going to add a little more interest. You can see you get 3 rows before you start repeating. I'm going to continue with this process. And then I will stop there and come back when the project is finished. Moving on to card number 4. We're going to be using hexagons, and we're orienting our paper at 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 with 4 1/4 across the top. And here I'm just trying to figure out where I want to start my first hexagon. I can do this any way that I want, and then just keep following that pattern. Now I switched to liquid glue, and the reason for that is I want, again, wiggle room. I want to be able to move, slide the piece as needed. Using the next color, the next shade of that color, I'm going to have just a bit of space between, and then I'm going to try to maintain that amount of space. Again, just eyeballing. So I'm going to lift that with my tweezers and place it between the other two and press down. So again, I've got equal distance between each of the hexagons, or as equal as I can eyeball. What I was pointing out earlier was there is some overhang on this card as well, and we're going to go ahead and trim that off when the time comes, just like we did with those small thin strips. We're going to keep going with this pattern. Now we're moving on to a different color. So I decided I wanted to mix this up a bit. Now I'm gluing on the paper rather than the hexagon when it gets to the edges, because it's easier to have less glue mess, I guess you could say, as I'm placing those pieces than it would if I tried to get the glue on the hexagon where it needed to go on the paper. I hope that makes sense. And I'm going to keep going with this pattern once again. You can see I did get a little sticky on my scrap piece of paper, but not as much as I could have. So I'm trimming again the overhang. And again, if you have non-stick scissors, this will work much better. But I really like my scissors, which are super, super sharp. And I'll take that over the non-stick any day. But that's my preference. So you can see it starts to neaten up. And I'm just showing that you can continue all the way down. You can stop at a point and leave some white space, up to you. Okay, the next piece, we're going to use my Sizzix Big Shot die cutting machine. This is how I created all my pieces today. You're going to start with well, in this case, it's a magnetic base and a very, very well-worn plate. Next is going to be my cardstock, and we're using 4 shades of yellow here. I'll lay that down, and then I'm going to put the die over the top. Now the die is a metal piece. This is from M.E.B. It's the circle thin frames, and it cuts continuous frames using the side with the sharper metal pieces. So I'm going to flip it upside down so the cut will go into the paper. Put another plate over the top. The color makes no difference. It just keeps things straight for me so I remember which is my top plate and which is my bottom. And then I'm going to lift up my circle, and you can see that all my circles are perfectly formed there. at least the center ones. And in order to keep them in order, I'm going to put some painter's tape, so some low-tack painter's tape across, and that will keep my circles in order, and I can take off the excess. I'm going to go ahead and do this for all 4 colors. And then we'll proceed with the card. Okay, so we're going to continue with the same process for all 3 colors. And now I have all my circles cut in each of the 4 colors. I also cut some white cardstock circles, 5 of them, about the same size as the largest circle I plan to use. And I'm going to go ahead and add some of the dot runner. You can use, again, any kind of dry adhesive will work fine for this process. Liquid glue less so, because it will dry before you can get done. So we're going to start with the first circle, and I'm going to figure out which is the largest. And in fact, this time I went with the second color because it was the smallest, to determine which would be my largest circle, if that makes sense. I didn't want to run out of the right size circles. I'm using my tweezers. I'm going to pull that first piece up, flip it around to the nicer side, the finished side, and glue it down to my circle. And take the next brightest of the yellows, and I'm going to count again. I believe the first one was the 11th circle. This one becomes the 10th. If you continue on in this way, it would be the 9th and the 8th, using the other 2 shades. You're just going to take your time and slowly add these circles in place. Okay, then I'm going to add my 4th color, going 1 fewer rings. Now if you make a mistake and you pick the wrong one, you just put it back and then choose the right one. Now we can either go light to dark and then light to dark again, or once again we can go light to dark and then dark to light. And that's what we're going to do here. But before I continue with that one, I'm going to start a second circle so you can see how we proceed, because we now no longer have the largest ring with the lightest color. So we're going to start with the largest ring on the second color. And that was a goof. I totally forgot to put my glue. So I go back in, add the glue, and try again. Now here I'm going to the next bigger size. And so on and so forth. And we're going to keep going through until we get all 5 done. And then we're going to use those to form some kind of a pattern on our background. But once again, we'll come back and see the finished product very soon. Okay, so here are our backgrounds all completed. The 2 striped, and I'm just showing that you can use this in any kind of configuration once it's done. And then our brick pattern. The brick pattern is not perfect. I had to trim it some, but in the end it'll be fine. That's our hexagons all done. And the circles, that center circle I lifted with some foam tape. And just going back through the completed projects. So here are the final projects. Okay, so I added some thank you sentiments as well as some jewels onto a black cardstock base. All of the cards have black cardstock bases, and I just added simple stamping using black and added jewels, or in this case pearls, to dress them up a bit. This third card, I changed the orientation. Instead of having it portrait, I made it landscape. Added some stamped letters to spell out hello. And some stamped and cut out images. And then I also added a little bit of glitter to the left of each letter to give a shadow, a drop shadow. And this one with the hexagons, I lifted the sentiment with 3D foam tape and added some jewels. I'm just pointing out the visual triangles of colors. And the last one, I just added some jewels and a sentiment. I'm so thrilled that you've joined me. I hope that you have enjoyed this 3-card series, and I hope to do some future videos very soon. Thank you.